Great. All right. Well, thanks very much for inviting me along this morning. Very pleased to be with you, even though I'm down in London. Great thing about Zoom is that we can do this all together. So the buzz about bees, the importance of bees and how to help them. So glad to hear that you're receiving a bee saver kit, and that will obviously help you with your local bees. So I really want to tell you a little bit today about lots of those different bees and the best ways that we can in fact help them and why we need to help them. So a little bit about me. I'm a journalist, co-author of 4 bee books. The latest one, The Good Bee, one of you will be able to win. And I'm co-founder of an organization called Urban Bees, which I set up with my husband a number of years ago to help educate people and to work with communities and companies in London to really help bees to thrive in towns and cities. So bees in the UK, it might surprise some of you to know that we actually have more than 250 different types of species of bee living in the UK. Most people think of they might think of a honeybee, but we've only got one species of bee that lives in a hive and makes honey. And we've got 24 species of bumblebee. Now, bumblebees are the ones that most people think of as a bee. It's a big, fat, round, quite cute bee that we see on the flowers in our gardens, stripy. But actually, most of the bees in this country are what we call solitary bees. There's over 200 of them. They're quite small, probably wouldn't notice them. Brown, black, not even stripy, but they're all incredibly important. So these are some of the bees you're likely to see in your garden at the moment, and because the weather's quite nice where you are, you might even see them this afternoon. So we can see here there's 4 different types of bumblebees that are out at this time of year. A buff-tailed and white-tailed bumblebee are the ones you're most likely to see just because they're big. They're very common, they're easy to spot. Early bumblebees, tree bumblebees are also out. But we've got the honeybee as well. Some of you, if you live near anyone with hives, you're likely to see those in the garden. What the bumblebees and the honeybee have in common is that they're what we call social bees. They live in colonies with a queen bee, worker bees, which are all female, no surprise there, and the drone bees, the males that really just have sex, really. And that's their sole job is to carry the genes for the next generation. So they live in what we call colonies. The honeybees can live up to about 50,000 of them in a hive at the height of the summer. And the bumblebees, maybe about 200, 250 of them in a much smaller colony. But the solitary bees, and the ones on this chart that you might see in your garden, the hairy-footed flower bee, for example, which is quite big and round, looks a bit like a bumblebee, the red mason bee and the mining bees, these are all solitary bees. They've just got a female who comes out in the spring or in the summer. She gets mated, she lays her eggs in a solitary nest on her own, then she goes away and dies, and the eggs hatch, eat, and emerge as adult bees the following year. They tend to nest quite close to each other, a bit like us, living next door to each other on a terrace street or in a block of flats. So often you will see a lot of them together, especially the mining bees tend to come up through the lawn or through bare soil. So you might see a lot coming through, but actually they're all solitary bees. And on the the bottom right-hand side, there's something called a bee fly that, not surprisingly, a lot of people mistake for a bee because that's what it's trying to do. It's mimicking a bee. The telltale sign is its spindly legs. You can see those. That's a dead giveaway. That's definitely not a bee. So they're just some of the bees that you might see if you go out this afternoon in your parks or gardens. Doesn't matter what type of bee it is, what they all have in common is, some people might think what they have in common is that they all sting, but actually they don't. The solitary bees don't sting. And bumblebees very rarely sting. You've really got to get in their way. They've got to feel like they're really under threat to sting. What they all have in common is that they all pollinate. And the reason they pollinate flowers that they visit is because the flowers have actually evolved over millions of years to attract the bees to pollinate them. So those beautiful scents, the beautiful colors of the petals, it's all designed to attract the pollinators. And the pollinators will go to the plants because the bees only eat food from plants. They only eat pollen and nectar. So they're completely dependent on the flowers for their food. And when they go to the plant, they will be collecting the pollen and the nectar. The pollen is the protein that they need to take back to feed their babies, take back to their nest or to the hive. And the nectar is the sweet carbohydrate drink that the honeybees will take back to a hive and turn into honey, which they store, and it's their winter food. That's why the colony will survive in the hive during winter on its honey. And the other bees will use the carbohydrate as a fuel. It fuels their flight while they're flying to and from the nest. And so they're totally dependent on the flower for those two products to eat. But the flower needs the bee to pollinate. So when it collects some of the pollen, it's also transferring some of the pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. And as a result, the flowering plant can then have fruits and seeds. And as a result of that, an incredible 1 in 3 mouthfuls of everything we eat is pollinated by pollinators, mainly bees. Globally, we've got over 20,000 species of bees, and they're even pollinating things like coffee and so many fruits and vegetables that we eat regularly, and all the nuts and seeds as well. But it's not just us that they're feeding, important as that is, they're feeding the whole of nature. So the fruits and nuts that the small mammals and birds are eating as well. So that's really why they are so incredibly important, all those wild bees, as well as the honeybees, which we often take into the orchards to do the commercial pollinating for us. The problem is that a lot of these bees are under threat, and they're under threat because basically they've lost a lot of their habitat. So over the years, due to things like intensive modern agricultural practices, we no longer have the hedgerows, we no longer have the wildflowers. In fact, in the UK, we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows since 1945. And as a result, there isn't so much food for the bees, and also urbanization. We've concreted over a lot of land, and those areas aren't particularly hospitable for pollinators. But we can help. There are things that we can do in our towns and cities to help the bees. One of the main things we can do is that we can help them by planting year-round bee-friendly flowers. It's quite easy, really. Here's some examples of flowers that are good for bees at this time of year. So there's Mahonia. It's a shrub, quite a prickly shrub that you find in many parks. And it's been flowering actually all winter. And some of its different types are now in flower in the spring. Crocuses, of course, we all love. Harbinger of spring, great for those bumblebees we saw earlier. Pulmonaria is a great one for the hairy-footed flower bee. You want to attract that lovely bee into your garden. Also, trees are an incredibly good source of food. If you think of how many flowers are on a blossoming fruit tree, they're out everywhere at the moment. In London, it's a bit cold for the bees to actually be out pollinating the fruit trees, unfortunately, but I think where you are, it's a bit warmer, so they will be out. So if you go and you have a look at any fruit tree at the moment, if you look up, you'll be able to see bees buzzing around, no doubt. If you've got a small garden, These are a couple of good trees for bees. A crab apple comes out a little bit later, and this cherry okame that comes out as early as February. So very good early food. The bees fly from around, different types of bees fly at different times of the year, but generally from February to October, you'll see some kind of bee flying around if there's the food for it. General rule of thumb is daisy-like flowers, very easy for the bees to get the pollen and the nectar, or a saucer-shaped flower again. This geranium roseanne on the top left-hand side, fantastic food for bees, and it flowers all summer. And the other thing the wild bees need is places to nest. Some of you might recognize this is a bee hotel. You can buy these in lots of garden centres now. It's a collection of hollow tubes that some particular solitary bees, the red mason bee we saw earlier, will nest in some of those tubes. The honeybee obviously is okay because it's looked after by the beekeeper. It's in a hive, so we don't really need to worry about the honeybee. But the bumblebees, a lot of them actually live underground. They might live just under a pile of old leaves. So if you can leave some old leaves in the corner of your garden, that would be fantastic. Or under some old moss, or under the shed, even in compost bins, they can be found sometimes. Bumblebees only last the summer. So if you can just leave it for the summer, in the winter, the colony dies out and the queen bee, she will go and hibernate and then come out the next spring and create a new colony. So leaving your garden a bit wild is very good because the bumblebees can nest under the wild parts of the garden. This is the kind of bee hotel that we like. We've got quite a few of these. This is our garden shed, and we've put a whole row of bee hotels facing south along under the eaves of the shed. These are cylindrical bee hotels, and this is what they look like inside. It's a collection of cardboard tubes, and you can see that these are plugged with some it's actually a bit of earth, and that's the red mason bee. It will go and collect earth and it will plug the bee hotel. So you know that the tubes are being used when you can see that they've got mud soil packed in at the end there. And this is a lovely little red mason bee being born. I just can't resist ever showing that lovely slide of the bee eating through the mud and coming through in the springtime. And these are leaf cutter bees. So you see that these ones are actually collecting leaves and plugging the holes with leaves they've collected, often from rose bushes. So gardens aren't always that keen on leaf cutter bees, but incredibly important pollinators, and we can easily help them with these tubes for nesting. You can even make your own do-it-yourself bee hotel with some cut bamboo and an old water bottle. Just make sure it's attached securely, not swinging around, and it's in a warm place about 1 meter off the ground. You should be okay. And you can also try and make a bumblebee nest yourself. I've not had much success with it, but I have heard they do sometimes work. The ones in the shops don't, but you could try using a flower pot, upturned, bit of nesting material. Apparently they often use rodent holes in the wild, little rodent holes that mice have used for nesting. So if you've got a pet shop, might not be open now, but in the future you might be able to go in and get some old mice nesting material and stuff it into your flower pot, upturned, a little bit of hose pipe, and leave it there. And this is the time of year that a lot of bumblebees are out, the queens are out looking for a new nesting site. The other thing, finally, is just to provide a drink of water if you can in your garden. Just a saucer will do. They're on the rim of the saucer there because bees can't swim. So the other thing to do is maybe put some pebbles or some stones in the water, and then they can land on those and they won't drown. So that's just a very quick run through some of the bees and how you can help them. So planting year-round bee-friendly flowers, shrubs and trees. If you haven't got a garden, you can do it in window boxes, patio, a few patio planters would help, or you can speak to your local park or other provider of green space nearby, and you'll be surprised to know that you're probably knocking on an open door, because bees are so popular these days that councils and landlords want to be seen to be helping bees. Creating suitable nesting sites and materials is also important, providing the water, ditching the weed killers and the pesticides, because they are bug sprays. So, bees are bugs, so they're going to affect the bees as well. If you can possibly bear to not mow your lawn, if you have got a lawn, leave it for a few weeks longer to let the dandelions and the clovers flower, which is very good early bee food. And basically lobby your council, the golf club, the housing developer, the landlord, anyone you know that could make a green space better for bees. Give them some ideas, say you'll even get involved. And I'm sure, as I say, you're knocking on an open door. Some resources that might come in handy if you want to know more. That's the Urban Bees website, Bumblebee Conservation Trust, a wealth of knowledge about bumblebees. If you want to go out trying to ID bees, then the Field Studies Council has a fantastic pull-out, very simple guide to the bees of Britain. If you want something more substantial, you can get huge, great field guides. The Field Guide of Bees by Stephen Falk is the Bible, really. But starting with the FSC is a good place to start. And just a bit more about me. I've got a monthly bee blog at the Urban Bees website, and you can follow me on Twitter at Alison Urban Bees, Instagram Alison_Urban Bees, and Facebook, although I don't tend to do that very much, Bees in the City. So I hope that's a good overview, and I'm very pleased to answer any questions that you might have.